There we go. Right. I was with AECI from 1971 to 1997. And I have to be honest, that photograph that was in the original flyer was a one-off. My girlfriend backcombed my hair for me that night for a party we were going to. And one of the guys I worked with, who had seen me about 4 hours earlier, was so convinced it was a wig, he tried to take it off. That's what I normally look like, which isn't a lot better. If anybody remembers the Rolling Stones from the mid-60s, I wasn't their drummer, but he does look rather like me. Right, on with the serious stuff. The background to all this lot, Jim Buttery was the OR manager of African explosives in the late 60s. AECI was half owned by ICI and the other half effectively by Anglo-American. And in late 1970, Jim was sent on a technical visit to ICI in England, which was actually a recruiting trip. ICI had seconded a senior guy, Harry North, who was a wonderful chap, to South Africa as the production director. And although he wasn't an OR man himself, he knew enough about what OR did for ICI in England to want it to do the same sort of thing in South Africa. So Jim, whilst it was a technical visit, was actually recruiting. I think John Hudson had already moved to South Africa by then, and Dave Bromley and Alan Hawcraft followed very quickly. I think I was next, and then Brian Fuller, Jeff Knights, and James Grant. For those of you who are old enough, I saw Hans was with us. A couple of those names might well be familiar. James Grant, just in passing, was the Scottish under-21 bridge champion. So we had some very serious lunchtime bridge during the department. We also acquired a world champion ammonia plant specialist and engineer. We were looking at building a coal-based ammonia plant at Modderfontein, and that was a fairly unusual thing to do. In those days, most ammonia plants were based on oil, but with sanctions, South Africa was using coal. And Reg and I came in on 6-month sort of temporary residence permits. And the government at that stage was a little paranoid. It was only about 5 years after Verwoerd had been assassinated, I think. And they revoked our residence permits when they expired. And one of the HR people had to go through to Pretoria and explain that there were about 3 people in the world who understood coal-based ammonia plants, and Reg was one of them. Could we please keep him? And while she was at it, she got mine extended as well. LP was the main thing we were doing. As most of you will be aware, the concept goes back a very long time, to just after the Second World War. The main problem with it was that it was mathematically demanding to just iterate through. It was constrained by computer capacity in those early days. And one of the ironies, I was doing my MSc in London in the late 1960s. The simplex algorithm involves inverting matrices, as you may know. As part of our exam, we had to manually do 2 iterations of an LP and manually invert matrices. Great fun. What we came out to in South Africa in those days, Anglo had the largest computer in Africa. It was at a place called the Dedicated Data Center, which we normally refer to as the Donald Duck Club. It had 0.5 megabyte of core in those days. This was back in the days when the input was punched cards and the output came out on line printer strips of paper that could be 0.5 mile long. And because of the constraints of the computer capacity at that point, the biggest LP we could get in had about 600 equations with 800 variables and took over the entire machine for a complete hour. And the accountants didn't think much to that. They would far rather be paying invoices and doing accounts. So we typically got 1 run per model per day. Things have improved since then, as you'll be aware. And what we were doing was building models of the way the company ran its production factories using variable costs. The one I was heavily involved in right from day one was what we refer to as the halogens business. It was the products that we made where we started off by electrolyzing a salt solution to produce chlorine and caustic soda. By modern standards, our turnover was somewhere in the region of 5 billion a year. There were 2 factories, 25 plants between those 2 factories, 15 products. The reason there were only 15 when there were 25 plants is that the 2 different factories produced quite a lot of the same thing. And in terms of the way we modeled it, we had 6 sales regions. Potentially, we had models a bit later on when the computing capacity improved with up to 3,000 equations. We didn't when we started. And we were doing budgeting. The annual budget was a major exercise, and the LPs were used for that. We were also doing what-if questions. Can we import this? Can we export that? Can we increase the capacity? And capital investment projects where we would be looking many years ahead to see whether the return on the investment, the incremental return, was enough to justify the investment. That was how things were laid out. The 2 red stars are more or less where the factories are. That one is Sasselberg. We were right next door to Sassel's original plant because we needed their ethylene. And that one should be on the coast. It's not quite, but it's at Mogontwini, just south of Durban. We recognized 4 South African sales regions. You'll see that we didn't think we sold much in the Northern Cape. We had an African sales region, which really was the rest of Africa. That blob isn't really quite right. And then the 6th sales region was exports. And equally well, we could import if we needed to. The product stream was quite interesting. The salt was electrolyzed to give caustic soda, hydrogen, and chlorine. And the chlorine was used to make all this lot, with the hydrocarbons that came from Sassel being the other major ingredient. Making all this lot by produced hydrochloric acid. So either you electrolyzed the hydrochloric acid back to chlorine and hydrogen, or if you were short of hydrochloric acid, you combined the hydrogen and chlorine back to hydrochloric acid. And this is what the factory at Sassel, this left-hand half is the factory at Sasselberg as it was when I arrived. And that was where the electrolysis was happening. That box is actually 2 different plants, which were electrolyzing the salt solution to provide the chlorine and the caustic. This right-hand side was the Colplex complex, which was built quite a few years later, and we'll come back to that in terms of the modeling. What's interesting here, which is fairly obvious relative to that previous diagram, is these loops exist where the HCl can go back to chlorine. And later on, when we had the Colplex plant in, we had the opportunity of moving stuff backwards and forwards there. So one of the rather obvious first points is getting any kind of plan out of there which mass balanced all the different chemicals properly was well nigh impossible manually. The accountants used to do the budgets on the back of an envelope until they got numbers which more or less balanced. Just in passing, there's hydrogen fluoride coming in here to make one of the compounds, the arctans, which we get a reference to later on as well. So that was just the Sasselberg site. The Mogontwini site looked very much like this left-hand half as well, although it used slightly different processes and made a couple of different chemicals. Some of them were things like perchloroethylene, which is a dry cleaning solvent, trichloroethylene, which is used extensively as a degreasing agent in the metals industry. The kind of equations we had, the first issue about the equations was agreeing what the coefficients were. If anybody remembers the metric chemistry, there are stoichiometry, which tells you in theory, for example, how much ethylene goes into a ton of ethylene dichloride and how much chlorine goes in. But the accountants had one view, the chemists had another view, the engineers had another view. So the start of all these models was round table sessions with all the participants agreeing what those variables were going to be. As far as I remember, it was 0.625 of a ton of chlorine and 0.375 of a ton of ethylene made EDC, for example, ethylene dichloride. Then the equations themselves were incredibly sophisticated. like the tons manufactured had to be no more than the capacity of the plant. And the amount you sold had to be no more than the demand or the amount available. So the individual equations were trivial. Even for the intermediates, the amount used could only be a maximum of what was available. The issue, of course, was that you had about 600 of these equations, all trivially simple. And what we were trying to maximize was what we called contribution. The revenue, the tons sold by this multiplied by the various selling prices, less the distribution costs, less all the input costs. Tons there is in quotes because some of the raw materials weren't measured in tons, but that's kind of minor. So that's what the objective function looked like. And we only used variable costs. Chemical plants, you normally run as close to capacity as you can. You obviously don't build them twice as big as you need them. And at the top end of that range, the structures were almost entirely linear. So linear programming was valid. The manufacturing costs were largely fixed. So we could, as far as the optimization was concerned, we could ignore those. What came out of this? Obviously, the economics. We got a objective function value, so you could compare the different ones to see which was the best. It allowed you to test those assumptions about what the coefficients were, about whether the sales estimates were good, bad, or indifferent. You got a mass balance every time. This was a delight for the accountants. Whatever else happened, they had something which balanced, which was not trivial, to put it mildly. Reduced costs and dual activities gave us things like transfer pricing. The marginal value of one of these products being used internally might be considerably different from the actual cost. We had the ability to do all the sensitivities, all the what if the sales values are wrong, if the selling price is wrong, if the conversion coefficients are wrong. And we could see, obviously, from the LP what the ranges of these sort of values were. So you could see if the transfer pricing of 100 applied for 5 tons or 1,000 tons, which was significant as well. Contribution, because we were only modeling variable costs, the contribution was what was coming out. It was what was contributing to profit plus fixed costs and overheads, because our contribution still had to have the fixed costs and overheads taken off before you had formal profit. Equally well, we could have been minimizing cost or any of these other parameters, but we didn't. We were maximizing profit. The uses which put this lot to, the annual budget was our annual nightmare. Every September or so, the budgets for the following year had to be put to the board for approval. And there was a very absolute deadline for that. It wasn't flexible in the slightest. So there were a couple of months leading up to the budget where the entire OR group, there were about 12 of us in those days, barely slept. And of course, you could also do all the what ifs around the annual budgets. If somebody wasn't sure what the sales demand was going to be, you could play around a bit and tell them what the various different ranges would be. During the year, we could look at things like, if we were short of caustic soda, how much should we import and when? If we had stuff spare, what should we export? If the market demands and prices turned out differently, we could obviously look at those. Annual shutdowns, I've got annual in quotes because for a lot of the chemical plants, it was only every second year. But for big chemical plants, you shut them down completely for a few weeks every year or two to do massive maintenance. And I'll come back into that in more detail in a couple of slides' time. And similarly, the impact of big plant breakdowns, whilst it didn't apply so much in the halogens area, the explosives area had explosions. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes as well. And then we could look at long-term what-ifs. Those plants, those 2 electrolysis plants that I mentioned up on the top left-hand corner at the Saddleberg plant, ran out of capacity. And they were looking at expanding them, and they didn't know how much to expand them by. So we looked at 3 different cases, I think, which was something like a 10%, a 25%, and a 40% expansion. looked at the capital involved and the benefit of having the extra product, raw materials, and they upgraded them by 25%. And then going one step bigger, if you like, the entire Colplex project, to the right-hand side of that diagram, which was tripling the PVC output that the complex was producing, we did a capital investment project on that as well to see whether the amount we were going to spend on it was actually going to pay off. One of the interesting asides, which the OR group claimed credit for to a degree, once we'd got this electrolysis expansion done at Sasolburg, there was spare chlorine at Sasolburg, and at Mbogantwini near Durban, they were short of chlorine. So we put a variable into the model to allow it to transfer chlorine from Sasolburg to Mbogantwini. And the model thought this was wonderful. It went berserk. So we took the idea, we had a contact, Fred Bester, who worked with us. Fred and I took the idea to the division manager and said, could this be done? And he explained how fiendishly expensive it was going to be buy a tanker that could ship chlorine. And we said how much, and it probably took them a couple of days for somebody to do the test checks. But it was going to cost them, I think it was $250,000 rands, which in South Africa in those days was a lot of money. And we were able to say, well, in that case, we pay off the capital in 6 months. So we did eventually get around to buying the tanker, and it was quite amusing. The divisional manager was a guy we knew well, Dr. Seddon Harrison, who retired and went to be a lecturer at Stellenbosch, if anybody down there ever bumped into him, although I think he was in chemical engineering. Fred and I prepared the expenditure proposal, and Seddon was signing it and grinned at us and said, you'd better be right, because it's not your name going on this proposal, it's mine. And it was so successful, in fact, that about 3 months later, they bought a second tanker. So it obviously had worked. Another amusing one was a telephone call I got from an ex-school friend of mine, believe it or not, who had been notorious even at school for being a bit of a scallum. And he phoned me up to say that there was a tanker, a shipping tanker, on its way to the Persian Gulf. This was back in the days when the Persians, who would it have been then? Was it Iran by then? Anyway, Iraq and Iran were at each other's throat all the time, and they just started fighting again. So this caustic soda tanker with something like 10,000 tons of caustic in it now wasn't going to the Persian Gulf anymore. And Jeff phoned me to say, what would we give him for 10,000 tons of caustic soda? And the comment about the scallum, there was a distinct hint that there might be something personal in it for me if I would organize this sale for him. So we fed this into the model. We said to the model, what would you do with 10,000 tons of caustic soda? And it went berserk. It totally shambled the entire country's, kind of chemical manufacturing. So we told him to take it away. We had the opposite version as well, as again, some of you might know, I think it's now in operation. The sand up near Richards Bay is rutile and ilmenite, I think it is, which contain titanium. And some people phoned us up to say they were going to beneficiate it, and could they please have 10,000 tons a year of hydrochloric acid, which was like half the capacity of our plant at Mbogantwini. So we put that into the model, and the model went bananas again. So we also contacted them and said, no, thank you. The fluorine that I mentioned earlier on in that diagram was an interesting constraint. We had an apple farmer down in the Eastern Cape somewhere who was preparing his apples for some sort of food. It might have been apple juice or something, I don't know. But he couldn't take the risk of having fluorine in his finished product. People don't like drinking apple juice that tastes of fluorine, apparently. So we had to constrain the model that it wasn't allowed to send hydrochloric acid from that factory. Multi-time period models were effectively cut down models, thinned out, hooked together, so that you had one model for each time period, and they were hooked together by the stock transfers and by the cash flows. Obviously, it all went into the same objective function. And depending on what we were doing, there were different numbers of time periods, as it says there, 4, 10, or 12. One of the things they were regularly used for was that item I mentioned earlier on about planning for shutdowns. If you're going to be without an ammonia plant for 5 weeks, then you want to build up stock, and what was the best way of doing that, how long in advance, all that kind of thing. And also to look at aspects like the import requirements you might be able to use to top up the stocks, and what the implications would be if the shutdown could be a week quicker, or if they overran and it was a week slower, so that they could be aware of what those implications were. We distributed caustic soda around the entire country, and the only places that we made it, as I said, were in Boghantweeny and Saddleburg. So we had giant stock tanks all over the country as well. There was one quite close to where I lived, funnily enough, in West Johannesburg. But they were all over the country, and we used to ship the caustic around. The demand for caustic was very seasonal, so we used to run this model every month to decide how much caustic to send to which particular storage depot when. So that was a very regular routine as part of the whole exercise. And then, of course, there was all the capital investment analysis, where you have a multi-time period model, back Dave, where each year is one of the units in the the model in. Try again, Dave. You would have 12 years in the capital investment model, which were basically all small models that were more or less the same, but with the different prices and forecasts and volumes and all that kind of thing, with all the capital going in the first couple of years, and then the profit coming out afterwards, so that you could see whether it was worth doing the investment. Now let's have a quick glance at a couple of the other areas. We also had a very similar nitrogen model, except that it was the ammonia plant at Modderfontein, and the second plant there was also at Boghantweeny. So we again had a similar structure, 2 plants, a bunch of products being made all over the place. The ammonia is turned into nitric acid and ammonium nitrate, and then urea and explosives. And the acids themselves, sulfuric acid is also involved in the process. The acids were also sold quite extensively. So we did essentially all the same sort of things with the nitrogen model as we did with the halogens model. I'm not going to go into those in any detail. The ammonia plant, as I said earlier on when I mentioned Reg Crane, was probably the largest coal-based ammonia plant in the world, and we did some capital investment analysis on that before it was started, although they had pretty well committed that they were going to do it by the time we were doing the investment analysis, just to check what the kind of implications were. We also had an explosives model, which was kind of a development of the nitrogen model. It was the back end of the nitrogen model, if you like, focusing specifically on the explosives business. As you might well be aware, back in those days, I'm talking about 50 years ago now, South Africa was probably the largest mining country in the world. We had an enormous gold mining business, platinum, iron ore, coal. Modder was undoubtedly the world's largest explosives factory, and Somerset West, which is next door to Cape Town, as you know, of course, was the second largest. And at one stage in those days, we were making 1 million detonators a day. The amount of product going out into the mining industry was mind-boggling, to put it mildly. So we did production planning for that as well. And particularly in the case of explosives, things go wrong from time to time. The explosives magazine didn't affect the OR, but I'll mention it just for the amusement. There was a bushfire one day in the area where the explosives magazines were, and there were, I think it was 20 tons per magazine of nitroglycerin explosives. And they were all placed far enough apart that if anything did go wrong with one of them, it wouldn't ignite the others. But there was a bushfire, and we had our own fire brigade. Modderfontein actually was a municipality in those days. In fact, if I can digress again, I was involved in strategic planning there. And on one occasion, one of the guys coming out from Carlton Centre to Mudderfontein for a meeting was late, and he was fuming when he came in. And we said, what's wrong? And he said one of the traffic cops they had an infamous traffic cop at Mudder. This guy had stopped Stuart and ticketed him. And Stuart said to the town clerk, why don't you employ nice people to be your traffic cops? And the town clerk very reasonably said, nice people don't want to be traffic cops. Anyway, the magazine went up, broke every window for a very the fire team put the fire out, they thought, but not quite. And they'd all left and everybody had gone home, and that evening the fire came up again and ignited one of the magazines, and it went off with a 20 tons of nitroglycerine bang, which broke every window for quite some distance around. And AECI very understandably said the following day, they apologized and said they would replace all the broken windows. So we had the feeling that we had probably replaced every window in Transvaal, which had been broken in the last 10 years. The import of black powder was another interesting issue with the black powder plant. We call it, the rest of the world calls it gunpowder. Black powder is a very important ingredient into a type of fuse, which is part of the initiation systems that goes with these detonators up here, used in the mining industry. And without black powder, the mining industry stops. And our black powder plant went up, unfortunately. And we did some runs on the model and realized we needed, I can't remember now what the amount was, I'll say for the sake of argument, 10 tons of black powder. And we checked with our AECI family, because AECI has explosives works all over the world. And there were some guys in Germany who could supply the black powder for us, but we had to get it to South Africa. And IATA, the International Air Transport Association, does not let their members carry any sort of explosives. I'm an airplane nut, as several of you probably know, and I had contacts who put us in touch with the Belgian Air Force, believe it or not. And our black powder was trained from Germany to Belgium, put into a Belgian C-130 Hercules military transport and flown out to South Africa. So the OR was a fairly small part of that, but was certainly involved. And then the next one's the interesting one, the R100 project. This is the title I give this. It's a sort of little sub-talk inside here, meta modeling for capital investment with uncertain returns. And the background to this is, we're going back again about 45 years still, but we had a very important problem, but we had no key data. And the way we used it, I thought was quite useful with hindsight, and might be of interest for other people if they're in a similar situation. The mining and explosives industry at the time was a symmetrical monopoly. We had one supplier, which was us, and we had one customer, which was the Chamber of Mines. And we had an interesting situation with Anglo, because of course they owned half of us, and they were comfortably the biggest member of the Chamber of Mines, so they dominated the Chamber of Mines as well. So a lot of the other mining houses had their reservations about Anglo's position. There was a new potential vendor who wanted to start selling explosives. In fact, we ended up with several, one of whom, of course, is Sasol. And we also had the competition board who thought taking out AECI would be great fun. So we had to look at the situation. We had a contract, which I was involved in setting up, funnily enough, which was a 10-year cost-plus contract, which said that the mining industry would buy from AECI. And that contract was quite interesting. We'd done a net present value model. We'd built it with 10 to 12-year projection and all the various different structures that the contract could be, which with hindsight, when we look back on it, was effectively a spreadsheet in Fortran. And if it had dawned on me that that was what I was doing, I might have been Bill Gates, but I didn't realize, so I missed out on that. We put a whole pile of contract structures in, and this 10-year fixed price contract that I mentioned was the one that we came out with, although I wasn't sure it was the one which was the best, but I wasn't the person making the decision. I might have been wrong anyway. So what was going to happen in this new scenario when the competition board said AECI will no longer be a monopolist? We were certainly going to lose market share. What would be the impact of that? What were the options? What should we do if we stuck to the old model, or if we went onto the new model, which involved capital investment? What would be the return on the investment? And it was a concept called decentralized shaft head deliveries. Let's have a look at that. The previous structure involved weekly or fortnightly rail deliveries to the mines, depending on how much they took. So the mines themselves had to have their own magazines, and they shipped the stuff from their own magazines down the shafts into the mine. And there was very tight legislation about how this was all done. What we thought we could do was open up some facilities near the various big customer groups and do the deliveries to the shafts ourselves. So the customers would be able to shut their magazines, which would save them money. And it would also mean that the new entrants had a much heavier competition to be level with us, because they'd have to do the same sort of thing. And of course, there were major implications on the legislation compared with what was happening at the moment, which I also ended up to my neck in, although that didn't have to be OR. And for anybody who knows HAZChem, that's what the trucks were going to have on them, saying that they were full of explosives. Now, here's what the general layout was. The two stars are our two factories at Somerset West and Modder. And these are the main centres where the mining was. This was diamond mining out in the Northern Cape. There was also diamond mining up in Botswana. And we thought we would put a factory up near Rustenburg for the platinum, one near Clarkstop. The Clarkstop one was more of a depot for the mining, gold mining in that area, one near Velcom, and one over in what in those days was the Eastern Transvaal, Mpumalanga, for the coal and gold that was there. So those were the options we were looking at. Now, how much money were we going to make on this? We knew the existing situation, we knew what profit we were making and all the various costs and so forth. And we had a reasonable estimate of what it would cost us to do the new version. We thought it was going to be somewhere in the region of 100 million, 105 in fact here, which is why we called it the R100 project, 100 rand. And we knew what the operating expense would be that went with that, because we understood how to make explosives. So we went to the marketing department and said, what happens if we don't put this lot in? And the marketing guy said, we've no idea. And we said, oh, so if we do put these new factories in, what will happen? And of course, we got the same answer. They knew even less. And we said, okay, well, now what do we do? And we had two versions of the model, the existing stuff, which we'd had a model for years, and then the one where we'd put in the new capital. And we talked to the marketing guys, and they said, well, if we stick with what we're doing now, we're probably ending up with somewhere between 40 and 60% of the market. Whereas if we go with the new version and these decentralized factories, we might keep somewhere between 70 and 90. So we've got a whole pile of combinations here. If we put the 70% in, we're going to get a profitability there. If we don't, and we've only got 40%, we'll get a profitability there, and we can subtract those two and get a return on the investment. And we did this. We ran all these different cases and did all the arithmetic. And bear in mind that this is back in around about 1980-ish, I suppose. And there had been a massive oil crisis from 1973, when OPEC said, the price of oil isn't $3 a barrel anymore, it's 25. And the world came to a complete halt. And those of us who were around would remember it. I suppose most of you were not even born. but it was dramatic, to put it mildly. And one of the consequences was inflation rates went up into the mid-teens. So we were looking at an investment return on, and this was still the case in 1980, we were looking at an investment return on top of an inflation rate in the mid-teens. So we were looking, these curves are what came out of the modeling after we put all these various permutations in. Up there, we would get about 22% back. 24% was what the what the board regarded as an acceptable return, given that the inflation rate was probably 15%. Down here, we'd have been making 26. Down here, we'd have been making 28. So if the difference was 90 compared to 45, for example, the value of that extra 45% gave us a return of 28%. And this was all being done in very close conjunction with the marketing guys, of course. So we said to them, what do you think of all this lot? And they said, well, that's probably where we're likely to be, somewhere in that vicinity. If we do nothing, we'll lose half the market. If we do all this stuff you're talking about with the shafted deliveries, we might keep 80. So the best guess they thought was on the right side of what was acceptable. So the investment went ahead. I was very heavily involved in that as well, although that's incidental. And 40 years later, AECI Explosives is still running, so it wasn't a complete disaster. Were we right? We'll never know. It's one of those situations where you don't get to run the two cases in parallel. You pick one or you pick the other. And that was the one we picked. But the key thing was that we were providing decision support. Without it, the decision would have been largely guesswork. We would like to think that with it, the decision was better informed. Right, that's the LP. Let's quickly have a glance at simulations and then I'll leave you in peace. Back in those days, IBM provided software. There were two different packages for doing simulation. Discrete event simulation was in a thing called GPSS. Continuous systems were in CSMP, Continuous Systems Modeling Package, which was an interesting package because it was a sort of superset of Fortran. After you'd written all the macros and described everything that went into it, it turned it into Fortran, and it then turned it into assembler, which meant that debugging it when it went wrong was practically impossible. And just as an aside, the first project I ever did in ICI was using CSMP to model the metabolism of a dog for drug research. So that wasn't South African OR, but it was my first meeting with CSMP. We did all sorts of stuff with these packages. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. When we were putting the complex, what would you call it, design, I suppose, together, we were very aware that the other half, the left-hand half of that first diagram, the stuff that already existed at Sasolburg, didn't have enough interplant storage. So we modeled the whole thing on a time base, continuous time base with breakdowns and all that kind of thing, so that the guys, the chemical engineers, could decide what was the right kind of storage. It was a huge model, ran very nicely. On the other side, the GPSS, one of the examples was bagging at the fertilizer plant at Modderfontein. All the main plants on a chemical factory are continuous. You run them 24 hours a day and as close to 100% as you can. So everything up to the manufacture of the ammonium nitrate was running 24 hours a day. But the bagging plant was manual, and the people didn't work 7 days a week. They got weekends off. And that meant that we had to turn down the ammonium nitrate plant. So we didn't have to shut it down over the weekend. But they weren't very good at working out how much to turn down and when. So we built a model of that in GPSS. It got down to a level of detail where we were including tea breaks, so that the workforce during the week were having their tea breaks included before we were able to get a model which was realistic. And it was then used so that as the weekend was approaching, the guys on the plant could look at the stock levels and decide at what point they were going to turn the plant down, say, to 80%, rather than run flat out until sort of 6 o'clock on Friday night and have to turn down to 30%. So that was the sort of thing that we were doing with the discrete event simulation. Also, just as a side, it was a few years later, inside the department, when the first PCs arrived, we built ourselves a simulation model of how much we were going to be using them and how many we would need. I don't know whether we got that right either. And the final comment I'll make is, for all I've been selling this from the point of view of us, the OR guys, the interaction between us and the guys in the divisions that we worked with, the people who did all the planning, were absolutely life and death. Fred Bester, the guy I mentioned earlier on, for example, used to play squash with us. We used to play bridge with some of the chemical engineers. So the relationship was a huge part of what was going on. So they built up a degree of trust that we were being honest with them and all that kind of thing. And the other amusing thing about it was Fred in particular got to a stage where he was guessing what was coming out of the LP just about as well as we were. So he would come to us and say, can we just check out so-and-so? I think it'll be X, Y, Z, but I need you to run the model to convince me. So that's what we were doing in the OR field 50 odd years ago, I suppose. Yeah, great fun as well. I'll call it a day at that. I think I've waffled on for far too long already. So back to you, Marty.
Thanks, Dave. This is fascinating. I would like to open, yes, I would like to open the floor for questions from everyone. So,
Sure.
So just unmute and share your question or maybe comments from any participant, please.
Hi, Dave. Thanks. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions. I won't ask them all. I'd start with, you mentioned sort of the budgeting, what if scenarios and capital interest type of questions, which I suppose are both applied to the sort of linear programming sections and to simulation. But what department were you sort of specifically in at that point, and how did you communicate those results, and what really was the reception to the results your models were getting? Were you seen as a group that was, you know, vital and providing trustworthy information, if we can put it that way, or were there sort of disputes about who had the better decision-making tools?
My objectivity here is obviously going to be questionable. We were a freestanding team. We were in the IT department, so there were all the people doing what in those days we called DP, data processing, and we had accounts clerks and people like that who were sitting there preparing invoices. So we were autonomous. We weren't part of one of the business divisions. We had 5 or 6 business divisions, and we were a service to them, just like the chemical engineering department and the research department were. And with this director, Harry North, who'd come out from England, selling the concept at a very high level, and to put it bluntly, essentially telling the divisional managers to use us, we got started. We were lucky that we had enough expertise coming over from ICI to know what we were going to do. So we weren't having to make it up as we went along. We obviously had to interact with all these engineers, accountants, chemists, whatever they were, marketing people, and convince them. But I suppose the sort of symmetry there was that they were providing all the data. We were providing the modeling structures which used that data. And we always made sure that we explained the results. So we had a standard process where whatever the question had been and whatever the answer was, the answer went with a page or 2 or 3 of explanation. So that if we were saying that a marginal cost was 127 rand and 32 cents, the maths of the arithmetic, if you like, of how that number had been developed was provided, which meant that we often went into the bowels of the LP in some detail to find out why that number had arisen.
Great, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I mean, you were talking to a group that was fairly, I suppose, fairly literate in the sort of modeling space as well. So I think, yeah, I'm just trying to compare it to some of sort of my experiences in trying to convince people that the modeling step is you know, one that you can trust.
Yes.
Yeah,
we had odd occasions with the caustic model, for example, because of the size of the model, it occasionally got its underwear in a knot. And we used to have to dig into that ourselves very, very thoroughly before we were prepared to take the results out to the customer, just to make sure that it had in fact done something sensible rather than got into some kind of an LP hang-up, which, as I say, did happen once or twice. But we didn't take those results to the customer.
great, thanks.
Just in passing, one of the comments I didn't make was that Sassel essentially asked the plants at Sasselberg, for example, the AECI plant is now part of Sassel. And Sassel now use more or less the same approach to help manage those networks and plants and factories. What they do is orders of magnitude more sophisticated because they've got better tools, they've got faster processing power, all that kind of thing. But conceptually, Marty might even have some comments on this, as she used to be in that group.
Yes, Dave. I wanted to know whether you ever used PIMS.
No, I didn't. I know it, but I never used it. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions from anyone else, or a comment maybe? Okay, Dave, then I have a question. I appreciated the conversation we just had now about trust amongst the modeling team. Let's call them the OR team or the modeling team, and the people who had a question and wanted to implement something, and the trust now that they have in this team. You mentioned something about that, and it has something. Relationships, social, and the trust that we need to build. You even mentioned things like bridge and squash, but I think it's very important for operations researchers to build trust with people that we're working with.
Absolutely, yeah. And David's point's valid as well. If you've got a customer, let's call him, who is doubtful or suspicious or whatever the right sort of phrase would be, then the onus is on our side, without a doubt, to do things which will help him to understand what's going on and get him to be comfortable with what we're telling him.
Yeah, and the example of the tanker that you've mentioned, you had to sort of put your head on a block to say, it will be worthwhile. And it proved to be worthwhile, so those people came to trust you.
Yeah, that's right. We were a couple of years in by the time that happened, so we'd been working with them for a while, so they were getting familiar with what we did, how we did it, and that particularly, as I said to David, we provided these detailed breakdowns of why the answer was 42.
Yeah, and also then coming to the goal that we have with this special interest group is to learn from the past and what we can learn from the past for today and the future. And quite a few things came up for me. The one is now this trust relationship, and the other one was you just mentioned about you maximize the profit, but you could have minimized pollution and stuff like that as well. And I think that's also something that we can take ahead. And then also something that you've mentioned was the 100 Rand model. How do we approach a problem where we have so many unknowns? And that to me was very interesting.
I think we were, I'm not even sure whose idea it was. I think we were chucking around the issue within the OR group. And a couple of us kind of said, maybe if we tried this. So yeah, if you're in that kind of a pickle, try bouncing a few balls around and see what comes up.
And the other interesting one for me was, for example, this acoustic soda that you could have bought, and you ran the model, and you said no. If you did not have the model, it would have been more difficult to give an answer.
Right. Yeah. The guys with the ship, I have no recollection now what sort of discussions we had about price. But given that they'd come, I think it was from the Gulf of America, so they were like 90% of the way and the cost to the Persian Gulf when things came unstuck. I don't think they would have paid us to take the caustic off their hands, but they would have certainly let us have it at a very competitive price.
Yeah, and I think things like happen today as well, and it will happen in future as well. It seems like something might be the right thing to do, but if you do the calculations and we do our OR, we realize no.
Yeah. As I said in the previous slide, it's decision support. We don't
exactly
take the decisions, but we give them better information for them to do it. Yeah, as you say.
Yeah. And for you, what would you say from your experience now, specifically now for presentation in the chemical industries experience? What is the main thing that you would take for the future for the people doing that type of job?
Well, the slide I normally end up with, which I didn't bother sticking on here because of the audience I'm speaking to, is a list of all these good things that OR gives you. And then it says at the bottom, but the real reason we do it is because it's fun. Being able to plug all these different angles in and look at the what ifs and add a bit of this and try a bit less of that and all that kind of thing. It's fascinating. Yeah, I can't think of a better way of making a living. The fact that we are also providing a very valuable service, and as the world gets more complex and big data and all that kind of stuff swirls around, we used to say, I don't know whether this is actually true, but the comment we used to make was that OR would improve your profitability by 5%. So the bigger you were, the more you could spend in that 5%. And as things are getting hairier and hairier, one could argue perhaps counterwise that with AI, the AI will do it and you won't need as operations researchers. I don't think that is the case. If you look at some of the garbage that comes out of AI, but anyway, that's by the by. I think the key thing is that we can help people make better decisions. Those kind of comments that you see on the I4's website, the British OR Society website, those are still totally valid.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's somebody's got their hand up.
Yes.
Hello, Marty. Sorry, I'm unable to switch on my camera because I'm watching via the web browser. Dave, it's Elspeth here.
If I remember, the first time for a very long time. Nice to hear from you.
If I remember correctly, then Prof. Geldenhuys invited you to speak to us. I can't remember in which year I was, first, second, third year. And you told us about the work you've been doing at AECI and about the linear programming. And I think it was my first introduction to OR and definitely got my interest sparked thought this is what I'd like to do, this kind of applying mathematics to real world problems. Yes, I think I spoke to Theo Stewart as well after that, and ended up studying OR.
Yeah.
So it's thanks to you.
I do remember that clearly. Yes. Again, as you say, I have no idea when. It was a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Yes, it was in the early 80s, very
Was
early
it?
80s.
Okay, right.
Yes, because I was a first year in 1980. So
Oh,
it was,
okay, right. So yeah, yeah. No, it's good stuff. Yeah.
yeah,
And still is. Yeah.
yes. Thanks, that was all I wanted to say.
My pleasure. Yeah. As you can probably tell from the way I've been waffling on, I still find it so enjoyable.
Yeah, it was, but it was so interesting. I mean, it was as interesting as it was tonight. So you definitely got me hooked
Thanks.
there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Isbeth, and hi to you as well. Is there any other questions, comments?
I have
Okay.
another, well, I have a whole list, but I'm only going to give one more question. I'll speak to Dave later. So, I mean, the blending problem in specifically, and I suppose problems like this are really classic examples of linear programming problems. But what has really happened? Are these fields being taught in the sort of chemical engineering and process departments that we no longer seem to have lost touch with the people that are obviously still doing this on a daily basis in these big companies? I don't understand why we're not seeing more of them participating in the Operations Research Society.
It's a very interesting question. One of the areas where it is used extensively, and if I can use the word anonymously, is the consulting industry. We had, now which one was it? One of the big consulting companies came into Modder to help us with some organizational stuff. And one of the guys, I was involved in the whole process for weeks on end. And one of the guys came over to me at one point and said, by the way, we can help you schedule the bagging in the ammonium nitrate plant better. That example I quoted on GPSS, which we'd done 20 years earlier. We'll build you an LP. And I said, well, thanks for the thought, but it's actually a simulation and we've done it already. But they do that kind of thing extensively. They just no longer seem to call it OR. And why that has happened, I don't know. Because if you go overseas, here where I am, Informs is huge. It's the UK likewise. It's still a very recognised topic, a label. Label's the word I want. Yeah. And I'm not sure what's happened in South Africa at all. But somehow, apart from us, and obviously there are places like UNISA and SASL where it's still very visible. But it's a very good question. I don't know what the answer is either.
Great. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, David, maybe that's something that we can explore in future as well, is getting people from the different industries, maybe in the bigger companies, and tell us, what they're busy with.
And we could talk to the consultancies like Deloitte and people like that as well, and Price Waterhouse, the guys who do that kind of thing, and see if we can find out a little bit more intentionally, if you like, what they're doing. Perhaps hook them in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, good ideas.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yes, I'd quickly just want to
yes.
on Isbeth's energy, and also just say, Dave, you were in your second presidency when I joined the society for the first time. So you were the first president that I met, and I remember how nervous I was at the gala banquet meeting you, and you were just such a gent. And I also worked with Marty at SASL, so lots of good memories. So I really want to thank you for this presentation, just seeing, where my first ORSSA president started, and then I remember working on some of those legacy models in the decision support teams. This has been so valuable to see actually how many generations these things have been passed down in Sasol's decision support team. So yeah, thank you for the work that you've done for the country and the work that you've done for OR and for Sasol, and your footprints are deep. And thank you for everything that you still do for ORSSA. You're still helping us on the EC. You're a special advisor to the EC, and we appreciate you so much. Thank you for this presentation. Thank you for everything that you've done for the society and for the discipline and for the economy. And yeah, your legacy is heavy. So thank you so much for it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. As I say, I enjoy it.
Thanks. I thought there was another hand up. Not so? Okay. Thank you. Then before I want to link onto what Lishan just said, I just want to remind everyone that we are planning our next event, maybe in June around there. And we've also distribute our little snippet for Euro for everyone's comments and inputs. And then Dave, thank you so much. This was really fascinating, and I can just repeat what Lishan just said. I think you are really an inspiration for many of us, and we really want to honor you and all our other valuable members who led the way over so many years. And I really hope that we can learn from you in the special interest group, even if you are not residing in South Africa anymore. Thank you very much for all the wisdom that you've shared this evening. To me, it was more than just the experience and the knowledge. I think there came a lot of wisdom as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. And then I'm going to close the event. Lishan, thank you very much for your support. I think we would have really have struggled without you. So thank you very much for that. And also for the rest of the ORSSA exec for the marketing and the organizing and everything. We really appreciate you.
And thank you, Marty, for looking after it all. Well done.
It's like you said, Dave, I do it because it's fun. May you all have a wonderful afternoon or evening.
Likewise.
Okay.
Afternoon
Thank
for
you.
me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay then. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.